No one in Harlan County would admit it later, but the night the worst blizzard in decades sealed them inside their homes with empty shelves and failing heat, every single one of them remembered the same thing. The sight of Ruth Sawyer 3 months earlier, kneeling in her dirt yard under the brutal August sun, coating clay jars with pitch while her neighbors drove past shaking their heads. Some had laughed. Others had called her unhinged. But as the storm buried the town under 8 feet of snow and the grocery store sat dark and stripped bare, those same people stood at their frozen windows staring toward the dim light still glowing from Ruth's farmhouse, wondering what she knew that they didn't. It had started quietly enough, the way most strange things do in small towns, with a single conversation at the grain co-op on a slow Tuesday morning. Someone mentioned that Ruth Sawyer had ordered 200 pounds of salt from a supplier 3 counties over. Not the pellets for water softeners or the blocks for livestock, but pure canning salt, delivered in bulk bags that required a flatbed truck. What's she planning to preserve? A whole steer? One man joked, drawing chuckles from the others leaning against the counter. But the salt was only the beginning. Over the following weeks, deliveries continued arriving at Ruth's property with unsettling regularity. 50-pound sacks of dried beans, cases of wheat berries, crates of root vegetables that should have been sold at market, not stockpiled, and strangest of all, a pallet of vintage glass canning jars accompanied by something no one had seen in decades, enormous earthenware crocks, the kind used for fermenting vegetables before refrigeration existed. Ruth herself was 62 years old, a widow who had lived alone on the same 20-acre farm since her husband died 8 years earlier. She wasn't unfriendly, exactly, but she kept to herself in a way that made people uneasy. She spoke only when necessary, attended church sporadically, and had a habit of studying the sky with an intensity that suggested she was reading something written there that no one else could see. She's always been odd, someone said at the diner one morning, watching Ruth load supplies into her truck outside the hardware store. But this is different. This is like she's preparing for something. The real gossip started when Ruth began digging. Not in her garden, but inside her house. Neighbors who drove past in the early mornings reported seeing her carry buckets of dirt out through the front door, day after day, until curiosity finally drove Martha Chun, the nosiest woman in town, to knock and ask outright what Ruth was doing. Ruth had answered the door calmly, dirt streaking her forearms, and said simply, "Expanding my root cellar." Inside the house? Martha asked, incredulous. Under the floor, Ruth clarified. Stays cooler that way. More stable. Martha had peered past her into the dim interior, where the living room floorboards had been pulled up to reveal a widening pit beneath. That seems excessive for someone living alone. Ruth met her gaze steadily. Does it? And that was all she offered. No explanations. No justifications. Just a quiet certainty that made Martha uncomfortable enough to leave without pressing further. But the story spread quickly, evolving with each retelling until half the town believed Ruth was digging some kind of survivalist bunker, and the other half thought she'd simply lost her mind to loneliness. Meanwhile, Ruth continued her work with methodical precision. She sealed the expanded cellar walls with lime plaster to control moisture. She installed narrow ventilation shafts disguised as ordinary floor vents. And then she began the preservation work that would define the entire fall season, the work everyone would remember later when their own shelves sat empty. She packed enormous earthenware crocks with shredded cabbage, carrots, beets, and turnips, layering them with salt and weighting them down with stones to ferment into kraut and kimchi that would last through the deepest winter. She filled dozens of glass jars with dried beans, rice, oats, and wheat, sealing each one with beeswax to keep moisture and pests out. She cured whole hams in salt, rendered fat into lard, and stored it in sealed containers. But the jars that drew the most attention were the ones she worked on outside, coating them with a black, sticky substance that gleamed in the sunlight. "What is that?" someone called from a passing truck one afternoon. "Pine pitch," Ruth answered without looking up. "Seals better than wax. Lasts longer." She buried those jars herself, lowering them carefully into the earthen cellar beneath her floorboards, arranging them in rows like soldiers standing watch. Potatoes packed in sand, onions wrapped individually in newspaper, apples layered between straw, carrots stored in damp sawdust. Everything organized with labels marked in her careful handwriting, noting contents and dates. The entire town talked about it at every gathering that fall. Ruth Sawyer and her buried food. Ruth Sawyer and her dirt cellar. Ruth Sawyer, preparing for a disaster that existed only in her imagination. What does she think is coming? People asked each other, half joking, half uneasy. But Ruth never answered those questions. She simply continued working, stocking her hidden cellar with enough preserved food to last through a winter that no one else believed would be any different from the ones before. Until the forecast changed. The first warning came in mid-November, buried in a routine weather report that most people barely noticed. A polar vortex destabilizing over Canada. Jet stream patterns shifting south. Moisture systems colliding with Arctic air in ways meteorologists described as concerning. Ruth listened to the report on her kitchen radio while organizing the last of her preserved stores, and something in the forecaster's carefully neutral tone made her stop moving. She pulled up the extended models on her laptop, studying pressure systems and temperature gradients with the focus of someone who understood that numbers don't lie the way reassurances do. The pattern looked wrong. Not just cold, but sustained. Not just snow, but the kind of weather system that settles in and refuses to move. By Thanksgiving, the models had worsened. Ruth made one final trip into town, buying lamp oil, batteries, and extra propane. At the checkout counter, the cashier laughed. "Stocking up again, Ruth? You planning to hibernate all winter?" Ruth counted out exact change. Something like that. That was the last time anyone saw her in town. By the first week of December, she had sealed herself into a routine of preparation, checking her cellar daily, monitoring food stores, ensuring every jar remained intact and every ventilation shaft stayed clear. The house above sat quiet and ordinary, but beneath the floorboards lay a hidden world of preserved abundance that no one else had bothered to create. When the storm finally arrived, it didn't announce itself with drama. It came as a light snow on a Tuesday morning, the kind that dusted the fields and made everything look clean and temporary. By noon, the snow had thickened. By evening, the wind had arrived, driving the snow horizontal across the plains. And by midnight, Harlan County had vanished beneath a white void that swallowed roads, landmarks, and visibility itself. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 3 hours. Then another 15. Power lines snapped under the weight of ice, plunging homes into darkness. The grocery store, already low on supplies after the pre-storm rush, lost refrigeration immediately. Perishable food spoiled within hours. And as families huddled around fireplaces burning through what they hadn't properly stockpiled, a creeping realization began to settle in. This wasn't a normal storm. This was something else entirely. At the Morrison farmhouse 2 miles from Ruth's property, the family gathered in the kitchen as their generator coughed and died, fuel lines frozen solid. They had food for maybe 4 days if they rationed carefully. After that, nothing. The roads were impassable. The phone lines were down, and the storm showed no signs of weakening. "We should have bought more when we had the chance," Janet Morrison said quietly, staring at the nearly empty pantry. Her husband didn't answer. He was thinking about Ruth Sawyer, about all those deliveries over the summer, about the jars and the salt and the root cellar everyone had mocked, about the fact that her house still showed a faint light through the storm, steady and unchanged. Across town, the same conversation repeated in darkened homes. People remembered Ruth's preparations with a clarity that felt like accusation. The jars, the crocks, the food buried beneath her floor in a cellar designed to hold steady no matter what happened above. She knew. Someone whispered in the Ramirez household, where 3 generations crowded into one room for warmth. Somehow she knew. But knowing and preparing were different things, and Harlan County had chosen comfort over caution right up until the moment caution became impossible. By the 3rd day, desperation began to override pride. The Morrisons were the first to make the attempt, bundling themselves against the cold and pushing through waist-deep drifts toward Ruth's farm. The journey that should have taken 20 minutes stretched into an hour of brutal struggle. When they finally reached her door, Janet Morrison knocked with frozen hands, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The door opened slowly. Warm air spilled out into the frozen afternoon, and Ruth Sawyer stood there, calm and unsurprised, as if she had been expecting them all along. "Come in," she said simply. Inside, the house felt like a different world. The wood stove radiated steady heat. Lanterns glowed softly. and from somewhere beneath their feet came the faint, earthy smell of stored vegetables and preserved food. Ruth gestured them toward the fire. "Sit. I'll make tea." Janet's eyes tracked to the living room floor, where the boards had been carefully replaced, hiding the cellar beneath. "Ruth, we didn't prepare like we should have. Our food won't last another week." Ruth filled the kettle without turning. "I know. We wouldn't ask if it wasn't. I know," Ruth repeated, quieter this time. She set the kettle on the stove and finally met Janet's eyes. "I built this for exactly this reason." The cellar door opened with a soft creak, revealing the narrow ladder descending into darkness. Ruth climbed down first, lantern in hand, and the Morrisons followed carefully, their boots finding each rung in the dim light. When they reached the bottom, the lantern's glow spread across a sight that made Janet Morrison's breath catch. Rows of earthen jars lined the walls, each one sealed with dark pitch that gleamed in the lamplight. Glass canning jars filled with beans, rice, and grain stood organized by type and date. Wooden crates held root vegetables packed in sand. Clay crocks with weighted lids contained fermented vegetables that would last through the deepest winter. The air smelled of earth and salt, and the faint tang of lacto-fermentation. It was a working pantry from another century, hidden beneath floorboards in a world that had forgotten such things were possible. "This is what you were building," Janet whispered. "All those months." Ruth moved between the rows, checking seals with practiced efficiency. "My grandmother taught me. She survived the Depression by knowing how to preserve food without electricity or refrigeration. When I saw the weather patterns shifting this fall, I remembered what she always said. Store when you can. You never know when you can't." She selected jars carefully, beans, rice, dried apples, a crock of sauerkraut, and loaded them into a canvas bag. "This will get you through 2 weeks if you're careful. Come back when you need more." "Ruth, we can't just take." "Yes, you can." Ruth's voice was firm. "That's why I made extra. That's why I dug deeper than I needed for just myself." The Morrisons carried the supplies home through the storm, and by nightfall, word had spread. Others came the next day, and the day after. Ruth met each knock with the same calm response. She descended into her cellar, selected supplies, rationed carefully to ensure everyone received something. The elderly Kowalskis who couldn't generate heat. The Ramirez family with young children. Even Wade Tucker from the co-op, who had laughed loudest about her doomsday pantry, arrived shamefaced and desperate. Ruth gave to him without hesitation or reproach. "I don't understand," Wade said quietly as she handed him jars of preserved vegetables. "After everything we said about you, why help us?" Ruth sealed the cellar door behind them. "Because preparation isn't about being right. It's about being ready when others aren't. And because my grandmother taught me that stored food loses its meaning if you let people starve out of pride." The storm lasted 11 days. Power stayed out for nearly 3 weeks. Roads remained impassable for longer. But no one in Harlan County went hungry, because Ruth Sawyer's earthen cellar held enough for all of them. She rationed, organized, and distributed with quiet efficiency, never asking for thanks, never mentioning the months of mockery. When the snow finally melted and supply trucks reached town again, something fundamental had shifted. People stopped dismissing preparation as paranoia. They started asking Ruth questions about fermentation, about root cellars, about reading weather patterns, and understanding risk. The county extension office invited her to teach preservation classes. Younger families asked to see her cellar design. One spring afternoon, Janet Morrison found Ruth working in her garden, preparing beds for summer planting. "You saved us," Janet said simply. "I need you to know that." Ruth straightened slowly, brushing dirt from her hands. "I just remembered something most people forgot. That modern convenience is wonderful until it isn't. That the old ways existed for reasons we're only starting to remember again." She looked across the greening fields, where other farms were beginning their own preparations, building their own cellars, learning their own preservation methods. Maybe that storm taught us something worth keeping. That summer, Ruth expanded her cellar again, not from fear, but from experience. And when people drove past and saw her coating new jars with pitch under the August sun, they didn't laugh. They stopped to ask questions. They took notes. They learned. Because Ruth Sawyer had proven something no forecast or warning ever could, that the difference between surviving and suffering often comes down to what you do when no one's watching, when no one believes you. when the work seems excessive and the danger feels distant. She had prepared when preparation was mocked. She had stored when storage seemed paranoid. And when the storm came and the modern world failed, her old-fashioned cellar full of sealed earthen jars had been the difference between desperation and survival. The following winter came and went without disaster, mild and manageable. But across Harlan County, beneath floorboards and in backyard sheds, dozens of new cellars held preserved food in glass jars and earthen crocks. And Ruth Sawyer continued her quiet routines, tending her garden, monitoring the weather, and maintaining her stores. Not as a prophet or a prepper, but simply as someone who understood that the worst time to wish you had prepared is when preparation is no longer possible.